Hi everyone, I'm Sostine. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about the making of Belle's blue village dress. But it's an everyday cosplay sort of look. So for all of you who've been following me in the past, you know that I'm really into making everyday cosplays or dresses that I can wear relaxing at home every single day, but also harken back to a certain character in an animated film. So for the most part, I've been calling them everyday cosplays. And I've mostly been doing characters from Ghibli films such as Sophie from Howl's Moving Castle and Kiki from Kiki's Delivery Service. Hence, I've been calling it Ghiblicore. But honestly, I've been itching to do some Disney and I really just decided to go and do it. In particular, I've been so wanting to make the casual or peasant looks for some of the more popular Disney princesses, namely Belle's village blue dress, Ariel's town dress, and Aurora's gray dress. I love the idea of wearing an everyday corset and wearing it around the house to sew, to play with my kid, and just go on grocery shopping trips. I know what you're thinking, oh my god, a corset, but honestly, if you've worn one that fits you comfortably, it's wonderful and it just gives you really great back support as you do your own thing. I personally find it has no detriment to how I function throughout the day. Now heads up, I'm not going to be tight lacing it or giving it any waist reduction. After all, waist reduction is not the point of a corset like this. I simply want to look great, have it give me the shape that I want it to give me, and also feel supported and comfortable. Believe it or not, my favorite Disney princess is actually Belle. She's a bookworm, she's really into taking care of her family, and she understands that feeling of being just a little bit of an outsider and a weirdo in her town.
But behind that fair facade, I'm afraid she's rather odd, very different from the rest of us.
A feeling that I, as an immigrant and a weirdo, understand. So I want to start with her and her blue dress that she wears in the beginning of the movie. By the way, this is not my favorite dress in the film. I may have already recreated the yellow dress from the ball and have plans to recreate it again in the future. At the same time, I just have such a soft spot in my heart for this blue dress. I remember watching the movie as a 6-year-old and wanting that dress so badly that I wore my inflatable tube float, which happened to be blue, around my waist and danced around my house and pretending that I was in a French village. Fun, I wanted that dress so much, so I think that this is the time to recreate it. By the way, this is Gideon. I've wanted to make it in the past as an everyday cosplay, and my first attempt was done about 6 months ago. I wanted to make it a blue dirndl sort of look, so I used a dirndl pattern from Folkwear. Just putting it on my dress form, you could see how shapeless it is. I hate the way it looks on me. I'm not even gonna show you. I hate it. I hate it so much. Let's just move on, pretend it never happened, and make it again. So my next plan was heavily inspired by the incredibly beautiful and talented Cosplay Cyanide. She's on Instagram. She does such beautiful work there and has the same taste in costuming that I do. Her black and white Sleepy Hollow dress is just chef's kiss, by the way. She also did a historically accurate Belle that I just love. Hers is based on a pair of 18th century stays, and I think she looks just so dang cute in it. So I thought I'd do something similar, but make the stays more similar to the actual animated gown, where you have the arm straps attached and get rid of the 18th century tabs, which are so distinctly 18th century. I wanted it to be front lacing so that I could dress myself, and moreover, Belle has an animated line in the front, which I chose to interpret as a lacing panel. Not to mention, I was so inspired by the idea of daily wear corsets, like the one that Cottagecore wear on Instagram sells. Alas, Cottagecore wear was sold out during the time I was trying to get my hands on this dress, so I decided to make my own. Of note, I can't decide for the life of me if Belle's village dress has a rounded front or a pointed front. Depending on the exact scene, and I guess the different animator, it seems to go back and forth. And I think that's just the way the cookie crumbles on hand cell animation, and thus it can be interpreted any way you'd like. But for this one, I chose to make it a V because I personally think those are prettier. Gideon, you're so cute! Now, before I get into the making of this outfit, I would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Acorn TV. This outfit, as well as basically everything else I make, takes a considerable amount of time spent hand sewing. I love to watch television shows from Britain and beyond. Most recently, I've gotten completely hooked on a Canadian show called Murdoch Mysteries. It features a tall, dark, handsome detective, hint, he's Detective Murdoch, and he goes around turn of the century Toronto to solve all sorts of murders using the burgeoning science of forensics. As someone who loves a good murder mystery and is completely addicted to Poirot, which by the way, Acorn also has, I am just loving going through all 14 seasons of this show. Just a little hint, I may be obsessed with the female protagonist of this show, the brilliant and charismatic Edwardian lady doctor, Dr. Ogden, who may or may not be the love interest in the show. By the way, you'll notice I refuse to call Dr. Ogden Julia, as studies show that women physicians are less likely to be called doctor and more likely to be called by their first name by both their patients as well as fellow physicians. So please keep this in mind and call your female physician by their respectful title when in the office, hospital, or turn-of-the-century morgue, or any other professional location. While Acorn TV does have all 14 seasons of this, they have so much more in a ton of different genres like romance and comedy as well as mystery. And they upload new episodes and shows every Monday. Hint, hint, you should also check out their other show, A Stitch in Time, from which I am currently working on a reproduction. With Acorn TV, there's always something new to discover. Try Acorn TV for free for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and use code SOSTEEN. Please keep in mind that this is case sensitive, so be sure to use it all lowercase when you put in the code to get the free trial. Thank you Acorn TV for sponsoring this video and also for having a show with an awesome lady doctor, who I may or may not be costuming at some point, by the way. Now, for the fabric, believe it or not, I found it while I was filming my episode about machine embroidery. I was at Jackman Fabrics when I saw like a linen and cotton blend section, and I was kind of like beeline there on my way to the exit, and I found the most perfect blue. I bought everything they had, which turned out to be just enough for the whole outfit, which turned out to be about 5 yards, 45 inches wide. For the base of this outfit, I had to find a non-historical corset pattern with a top that extended above the nipple line, had a similar shape to the Belle, including the straps, and laced in the front. I didn't actually manage to find a corset that did all this, but I found one that was relatively close. It turned out to be back lacing and not front lacing, but otherwise I really liked the shape, so I just decided to go with it. I printed it out in my size and taped it all together and made a mock-up. I turned it from a back lacing to a front lacing corset by taking out the seam allowance in the back and putting it on the fold, and then adding the seam allowance to the front. Of note, the first mock-up was wonky. The area under the armpit was just too small and the straps dug into my arms. So I added 1 inch under each armpit by extending the side seams by ½ an inch on each side, and then took out that extra length from the center back seam. I also made some changes to the shape of the corset. While the original goes about 2-3 inches below the waist, I stopped mine at about ½ an inch below the waist, so it looks more like Belle's original bodice versus theirs. I ended up making a second mock-up to test it, and once I was fully happy with it, I started cutting into the final fabric. While I used cotton twill for the mock-ups, for the final, I cut it in coutil as well as the linen that I bought at Jackman's. For those of you who don't know, coutil is a very tightly woven fabric with very little stretch, so it's generally preferred for corset making. I buy mine from Richard the Thread. Please note that while the corset patterns frequently have seam allowances for the sides, they do not have this for the top and the bottom, as this will be covered by binding. So then I ironed and pinned the linen to the coutil, right sides out, wrong sides together, and flatlined it with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I took a moment to serge all of the side edges of the stays using my Baby Lock Victory, since those will not be further finished. After that, I sewed the basic corset shape together. Afterwards, I ironed open all these seams and did a line of straight stitches about 3/8 of an inch away from each seam so that I could make a channel for the boning, 2 per each seam. I meant to make each channel about 3/8 of an inch in order to accommodate a 6mm wide piece of synthetic whalebone from Burnley and Trowbridge, but I frequently found that I made them a little bit too small. For those channels that were smaller, I didn't bother sweating the small stuff. I simply used a 4mm piece of synthetic whalebone instead. Please note that I made the boning slightly smaller than the entire length of the corset by making about 1/2 inch shorter on the top and the bottom to accommodate the binding I will have to put in at the end of corset making. I did that for all the seams. Afterwards, I did a quick machine stitch to sew the boning in at each end about 1/4 inch from the top and the bottom. I tried it on, but I did find that the corset needed another piece of boning by the bust to reduce the wrinkling there. The original pattern by Ralph Pink calls for it, but I thought I could get away without it, but it turns out they were right. So to add this, I simply put a seam right there. I drew it out with friction pen, which of course disappears with heat, and then sewed it down using a machine. I used a seam ripper to unstitch the flat lining stitch at the bottom of the corset and put the boning in between the linen and the coutil. In the back of the stays, I did something similar. I did 3 horizontal stitches so I could put 2 pieces of boning in the center back. I figured out where I wanted the center seam to be in the center front, and I simply folded back the seam and sewed in the channels. You'll notice I have channels in the center front with a 3/4 inch gap and another channel. This is so that there's room for the eyelets to go in the center front for lacing. For the eyelets, I used actual grommets. I use 0 size grommets from Richard the Thread. If you do like to make a lot of corsets, I highly recommend getting an actual grommet die setter. It makes it so much prettier and easier and stronger than the kits you can get from Joann's. So to do this, I used a clover tapered awl that gets quite wide at the base and stretched out a hole in the coutil. Using an awl breaks as few fibers as possible and rather just pushes those fibers to the side so you have room to put the grommet in, and then afterwards goes back around the grommet to make it stronger. I then put 2 parts of the grommet in and positioned it in the setting, and then used a hammer to hammer it in place. I did this for all the eyelets, a process which was much louder than this video suggests. Now I tried the corset on, video not shown for modesty reasons, and I really loved it. I did have to adjust the straps a little bit, but otherwise it fit exactly as I wanted it to. Now it's time for the binding. To do this, I cut some 2-inch wide bias tape, though I really needed only 1.5-inch wide bias tape, so don't beat me folks and go less wide, it saves fabric. And then pinned it to the unfinished edges of the corset, right side to right side. I highly recommend going all nuts here with the pins and pin every 1/2 inch to 1 inch. I then sewed it down with a 3/8 inch seam allowance on a soprano. Using an iron, I ironed the machine seam upwards. I then pulled the bias tape around the raw edge of the stays and folded it on the underside, enclosing all the raw edges within. I then sewed the bias tape down by hand, including all the corners, so that they were all nice and neat. Please note that the bias tape on the underside has only been sewn to the coutil, which means that it is not visible from the outside of the corset. Finally, I laced it with some cotton ties I bought at the same time that I bought the fabric from Jackman's and put in a modesty panel. To do the modesty panel, I cut a piece of blue fabric twice the width I wanted it to be, and then sewed the top and bottom wrong sides out. I turned it inside out. I then hand sewed it to the corset about 1 inch away from the eyelets so that it wouldn't get in the way of me lacing myself up. And the bodice was done. But now it was time to tackle the skirt. Honestly, I wanted a circle skirt for this.
I want adventure in the great white somewhere.
I'm sure that Belle wouldn't have had a circle skirt, because if this were truly 18th century, a circle skirt is just such a waste of fabric and they would have just used 2 rectangles instead. However, I love the way that a circle skirt flares when you spin, and I am cosplaying a Disney princess. So I decided to go with the circle. Now you can simply use simple math to figure out how big to cut the circle to make it. However, this takes time and patience and time. And my friend Angela Clayton actually has a pattern shop and channel, and she sent me a vintage circle skirt pattern the other month. So why waste precious time doing that when I can literally cut out the pattern she gave me? So I traced out the skirt pattern, and it was a little long on my very short 5'0" body, so I actually ended up clipping 2 inches off of the bottom. And then I cut out 2 huge semicircles. For the pockets, I cut 2 large trapezoids, a little bit larger than my cell phone, and sewed each one to the mirrored sides of the circle skirt, 3 inches from the top. Once I did that, I ironed the pockets outwards and steamed it. Then I put the 2 half circle skirt pieces together, the 2 right sides touching each other, matching up the pockets nicely. I then sewed the skirt side seam, starting at the top and going around the pocket and then going to the bottom of the skirt. I then sewed in the waistband. The waistband is a 4-inch piece of fabric, and I simply got this large rectangle and pinned it to the top edge of the circle skirt. I sewed it together and then ironed the waistband upwards. I folded in 1/2 inch seam allowance from the top of the rectangle and then folded it down towards the waistband so that the entire raw edge of the skirt top was enclosed in this waistband. I did not sew this down yet since I wanted to add the zipper first. Now, in a full circle skirt, I didn't want the pocket to drag down the fullness of the skirt with the weight of my cell phone in it. So to take the weight of the cell phone off the skirt, I sewed a piece of 1/2 inch linen tape from the pocket and sewed it to the other end of that tape to the waistband of the skirt, making sure that this piece of linen was in fact shorter than the distance from the pocket top to the skirt. So the idea being that when there's something heavy in the pocket, the string will carry the weight of the object within rather than the sides of the skirt. This ended up working really well, and I highly recommend it for those of you who like full skirts, but also carrying heavy things. This really just made the twirliness of the skirt fantastic. To add in the invisible zipper, I got my zipper and then opened it. I pinned it to the right side of the fabric and used an invisible zipper foot for my baby lock soprano to stitch a line of stitches as close to the teeth as possible. I did this to the corresponding side, about 8 inches down for each side. Since the zipper I had was far too long and the store didn't have anything medium, I really ended up using a 22-inch for this. I cut off the excess zipper and then stitched it across the teeth so I wouldn't accidentally open it too far and thus ruin the zipper. I then did a line of machine stitching from the bottom where the zipper is finished all the way to the bottom of the skirt, thus making it a full circle skirt. I ironed the seam open. Please note that the top of the zipper starts about 1/2 inch down from the top of the waistband, and this was on purpose so I could add a hook and eye, which I then did. I also hand stitched the top of the waistband down, using the waistband to cover up the top of the zipper. At this point, I tried on the skirt and corset together and determined what length I wanted the skirt to be. I really liked it rather long, so I kept it that way. I then machine hemmed it. To do this, I simply folded over the edge of the skirt twice to the length I wanted it to be and did a simple running stitch all the way around using a machine. And then the skirt was done, complete with a pocket for my cell phone, of course. I suppose it's time to try it on. I could have made a blouse for this, but I already had a lovely linen blouse from Little Women Atelier. I decided to go with that one instead. To put this on, I would recommend not wearing a bra, but putting it directly on since your corset will be acting as your support. I would have loved to have had a small French village to walk around, but as it happens, in these pandemic times, no one is going to go anywhere outside their local vicinity. So I took my son to one of my favorite local museums, the St. Louis Museum of Transportation. But of course, I couldn't resist putting myself into the movie anyway. In any case, I had such a great time working on this and I love wearing it. The corset gives really great back support, so I actually find lifting my toddler and walking around in it easier to do in this blue outfit than I do without it. I have so many different ideas in my head for different daily cosplays and princess dresses. There's a ton that I plan on making, from Ariel's Day in the Town dress, Belle's yellow gown again, and even Anastasia. Yes, I know she's not technically Disney, but please let me know in the comments if there's one in particular you'd like to see me tackle next. So see you next time. And if you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe.